Welcome back, everyone. Today I'm going to be painting this Kingdom Death model, this archer here, in my kind of, I'll call it quote-unquote monochrome paint style. I guess my more subdued paint style that I have for these models, since the universe takes part in like this dark, dreary world. For most of my models, I started out painting them in kind of a monochromatic black and white tone scale, so that looked like they're dark with very dramatic OSL effects on my models. But as time has gone on, I've added more and more color and vibrancy to my color palette as I just really like the detail on these models, and I felt like my just purely gray and black tone paint jobs were not doing them justice. So I'm going kind of for more, I guess it would be called tenebrism, more dramatic effect between light and dark, showing only the very apex of the highlight, putting more things into shadow. So I'm just going to walk through how I paint this. I think I'm not quite there. I don't think the effects are quite dramatic enough on especially the skin, but I keep experimenting with it, trying to get this very dramatic effect that you'd see in like Renaissance painters like Caravaggio, that sort of thing. So sit back, relax as I walk you through how I painted this model. So here I'm going to be starting on the skin, and we're going to set down a base layer, which are some very thin glazes of the Scale 75 pink flesh mixed with some black leather, which is kind of like a dark purpley brown. And I feel it works really good as a kind of shadow color for skin, more so than my historical miniatures or even Games Workshop miniatures. When I paint these, I basically just work in glazes, keeping the paint real thin and kind of doing the rule of three of putting down at least 3 coats of every color before I move on. Putting down the second layer again using very, very thin paint, building up slowly until I have that nice base color that I want. So now I'm just going to be adding a little more pink flesh into that dark flesh mixture that I made before, slowly building up the color layer by layer, using, again, very thin layers of paint. Again, adding even more pink flesh now, hitting less and less of the area on the leg, focusing more on the top of the knee and the thigh there, and here on the back of the thigh, places I think light will be hitting. Moving almost all the way up to the pure pink flesh, focusing again on the tops of the leg, her elbows, the top of her cheeks, place I know light will catch. And I'm going to do, with this pink color, I'm going to do a lot of layers of this, slowly covering smaller and smaller portions of the leg. Probably going to be doing 5, maybe 6 layers of just this pink flesh. great thing about using glazes, especially on skin, is it takes a while for you to build up to the, I guess, the full potential of the color, the full brightness of the color when you're using glazes. And so you can really give really subtle transitions even without doing much blending by just keeping your paint very thin. Now to get the highest highlights, I'm mixing in a little bit of pale flesh from scale 75 and just doing little dots, striations along the leg to give it that really high contrast. Normally on a mini, I would paint much more of the skin with this color, but again, since I'm trying to make it look as if she's standing in low light, kind of in some shadows, I want to only touch little portions of the skin. I want to try and leave this kind of what would probably be considered a mid-tone color to be only on the highest portions of her skin where I know some of that light will be hitting. And now I'm taking a bluish gray that I watered down to a very, very thin glaze, using it as like a filter to run it over my model to help tie the colors together to knock down some of those really high highlights. And I like to use this color as shadows, so I'll be going back and building up the shadows like on the underside of her thighs and knee. I think this color does a really great job of, again, simulating shadows on skin and even clothing. I often use this all across my Kingdom Death models to help darken my paint scheme down a little bit. Now I will work on the clothing of the archer. She is wearing lion skins. It's kind of hard to tell, but that's based on one of the monsters that you fight in Kingdom Death. So I'm going for like a tawny yellow look to her clothing. So I'm starting off with this yellow ochre color, and I'm going to base coat all the shadows with that. I'm also going to reinforce those shadows, as you'll see here, with a little bit of purple to really draw out the contrast. But as you can see, I'm leaving the areas that I want to keep as a highlight. I'm leaving those still this grayish white color, just to ensure that I don't have to do as many layers of my glaze to build up the highlight. So as you can see here, now I'm going over the highlighted area with this gold yellow from scale 75, and I'm hitting all the areas that I want to catch light. And you'll see we already get, after just one layer, some nice contrast between that yellow ochre color and this lighter gold color. Now, as I said, I'm going down with a watered down purple color. I really like purple for drawing out yellows and greens especially. I think it does it's a good contrast, and I think it looks pretty realistic as a shadow for this color. So I'm just going in with thin coats of that purple and laying it in the deepest recesses and deepest shadows, even getting some more, I guess, less watered down purple and putting that in the folds of her clothing here. Now I'm going to go back over the model with that yellow ochre, that very dark brownish yellow, and I'm going to glaze it down and kind of cover those areas. I just put that purple to help kind of blend them together so that the purple doesn't stand out quite so striking on the model. Then I'm going back in with some of that watered down highlight color that I used, that yellow goldish color from Scale 75, and going back over the highlights since it got toned a little bit down with my layers of that yellow ochre. Once I have my highlights down again, I'm going to use that grayish blue again as a filter to tone down her clothing to make more of this tunic here fall into shadow. I'm going to try to avoid going over the highest highlights with this, just keeping it to places that I want just kind of a soft shadow. Going back in, and I actually mixed some buff with that that golden yellow, and here I'm just hitting dots, doing little striations in places that I want to have a lot of contrast, that I want to be the highest highlight on the clothing. Now we're going to go ahead and paint the bow. As you can see, I painted the hair and already set down a base coat. I actually had a file get corrupted here, so you're going to miss me painting her hair and setting down the base color. But basically, I just, for her hair, used a black mixed with higher shades of a bluish gray, the same ones we actually used for the shadows across her tunic to get her hair. And then I just set down some green ochre, actually. I like to use that for my base color for bone. Now, I used to use a lot of browns for my darker shades, but I like taking this kind of greenish brown and mixing it with buff and all the way up to white to get my highest highlights. So I put down that green ochre, started mixing in some buff into it, and now I'm just hitting less and less of the bow, working my way all the way up to almost pure white, I guess more of an ivory color in the highest highlights. Now I'm going to paint the arrows. I'm going to put a base coat down of some dark purple, and then I'm going to go over it with shades of red. I love using purple for my shadows for warm colors. I think it looks really good when you layer reds and yellows on top of it. Here we are, just overbrushing it with some red, giving it these arrows a highlight. I want these arrows to kind of pop on the model, give it some much needed color. And then as my final highlight, I'm going more with like an orangish red, just hitting the tips of the arrows. Now I'm going to work on the OSL effects. Again, since these models have this kind of play between light and dark, I like trying to do pretty dramatic OSL on these Kingdom Death models. And I like using red for my darkest tones. I know it's not the most realistic, like if you look at the light put off by like a lantern or even a fire, usually the tone is pretty yellow, white light. But I think that a lot of times when I see just yellow OSL on models, they just look strange. They look kind of eerie. And even though this isn't realistic, for some reason, at least to my eyes, I like moving from red up to yellow, doing reds, oranges, and yellows up in the high highlights. I think in your mind, it makes it look like the light put off by a flame, you know. So again, I'm just using this kind of dark scarlet that I mixed with some orange, setting down the base tones, and then I'm just going to keep adding more and more orange using very watered down, very thin glazes of this red. And as I go up and use more and more orange, I'm hitting less and less of the model, focusing on areas right next to that lamp where I know like the most light will be hitting. Also hitting areas that are really pronounced, like on the folds of her clothing and on her elbow and things like that, and here on her leg that is right next to that lantern sitting on her hip. Now we're getting pretty much into pure orange, and again, just hitting the areas that I think light from that lantern will be hitting the most. So here focusing on the back of her quiver, on the folds of her clothing underneath her arm, and even on the top of her left leg. Now I've added a little bit of yellow into that orange and are going to be hitting even less of this area that I want to be bathed in light from that lantern. Now we've worked our way up almost to pure yellow. Here I'm just doing little striations, little dots along the areas that I want to be under the kind of highest highlight of this lantern. Then I'm mixing a little bit of white into that yellow, and I'm just going to put a few dots here and there, areas I want the highest reflection off that lantern to be. And then for the lantern here, I did the same thing, starting with kind of red at the top of the lantern, moving down to orange and yellow at the bottom, and then going over and hitting kind of just the midsection, I guess, of the yellow that I put down, just with some white, and I think it gives a decent looking lantern effect. Then the last thing I'm going to do, so I'm going to go back in with that grayish blue and just go over more areas, especially of the skin, to help emphasize more darker shadows, to give that higher contrast between the pink skin on the top and her legs that are falling into shadow. Again, I want this to make it look like we're in low light, maybe dusk or dawn sort of circumstance. I don't think I quite got there even with adding these shadows, but I think I'm getting close to the effect that I'm looking for on these models. I want to have a nice balance between being able to use a wide variety of colors and tones and still giving that kind of dark effect that that I think is kind of key to the setting of Kingdom Death. So here is my completed archer. I'm actually going to be using her here in a game in a few days, so got her done just in time. And I really love the detail of these Kingdom Death models. They're one of the few models I can spend hours and hours on and not yet get bored with the model. And I really like this paint scheme that I'm moving towards, moving away from just monochromatic to having wider color palette and more dramatic shadows and highlights. I think it's going to incrementally look better and better each model I get through. And I really need to make a video on why I think Kingdom Death, especially in the time of COVID, is perhaps one of the best solo games that you can play right now. And of course, you have these beautiful models to go along with it. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed the video, were able to get something out of it. If you did, please hit that like button, subscribe, and I'll see you soon with a new video. Take care.